Want to expand the reach of your content? Start a podcast. Feature industry experts on your show and leverage the influence and reach of your guests to grow your brand. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to the B2B Growth Show. I'm your host for today's episode, Sean Blackburn with Sweetfish Media. I'm joined today by Chris Eifert. He is the principal at Tricom B2B. Chris, how are you doing today?
Doing great, Sean. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Yeah, I'm glad that you're here. Today, we're going to be talking about an exciting topic, in my opinion, and one that's super pivotal, the role of emotion in B2B decision-making. But before we jump into that, please tell our listeners a little bit about you and your background and what it is you guys do over at Tricom B2B.
All right, sure. Thanks, Sean. Appreciate that. Well, my career probably started a little bit differently than most, as I'm a degreed engineer. So the beginning of my career really started as an engineer in a lab doing testing work and a lot of mechanical engineering type work. And I discovered pretty quickly that the client-facing world of sales and marketing was a little bit more my thing. So I progressed through some industrial and technology sales, product management, product development roles. And it wasn't until about 15 years ago that I transitioned to the marketing agency side of things. So my business partner and I, we bought a small successful agency about 13 years ago. And that's what Tricom B2B is today. And very early on, we envisioned an agency that would focus exclusively on B2B and kind of with a very specific expertise in this technical considered purchase space. And, since then, we've been purposefully building and growing this B2B agency, and we're operating very successfully today in beautiful Dayton, Ohio, and we serve a lot of really important national and global brands from here.
It's fantastic. And our topic today on the emotion and everything that goes into that with the B2B decision-making process, kind of give us off the top, why do you feel like this is such an important topic to unpack?
Well, as an engineer by background, you might be surprised to find that I truly believe in the role of emotion in B2B marketing. And I go back to, decades ago when I was in industrial sales and industrial marketing roles. And sometimes I feel like when I look at marketing efforts in our industry today, it's like I'm in a time warp back to that time in my life, because there's still so much going on in marketing and how companies are messaging their products that's very product focused. It's very facts and figures and features and benefits, and there's tables and specifications. And this isn't just in collateral. This is in websites. This is in advertising, and it's 25 years now of lowest total cost of ownership, the best efficiency, best in class type messaging, and we know this doesn't work in marketing and advertising, yet it still persists. And it's one of the things that we as an agency, and frankly, just as marketing professionals, are really working to improve upon and help our clients and help the industry as a whole understand better. A lot of shining stars that do it well, but I think the vast majority of B2B marketers are still performing very similarly, and it's a little disappointing. And I think there's just a lot of improvement opportunity to work more emotion and connect better with customers.
What is it that you think overall, because I totally agree, what is it that you think kind of gets in the way of the typical B2B marketer who maybe can't break out of those old habits? Anything that you kind of see that's pretty common?
Well, I think it's a couple of things. So if you think about the business-to-business industry, and especially the space that we operate in, there's a lot of very technical content. There's a lot of very complex offerings. A lot of the work is performed, and and not just the work behind the scenes with the engineering and so forth, but even with business development and marketing, a lot of that work is performed by engineers and product managers with a lot of technical background, very rational point of view as they look at marketing and how they want to talk about their products, and also a lot of risk at adversity.
Mm.
So I think, you put all of those things together, and I think there's still a belief that, hey, the more I tell, the more I paint a picture of every feature, every design element, every benefit that we can put into our marketing message, the better this is going to be. And I think just a lot of that's just a mindset that exists with the type of people that are responsible for marketing in some cases. And in some cases, I think it's just maybe a lack of understanding that that's not connecting. And the good news is there's a lot of science, there's a lot of business research now that says, hey, it's not working or it won't work for these reasons. And I think there's a real opportunity for us to educate marketers that are doing it kind of in the old traditional way and make some changes for the better.
I love that. And, you mentioned some of the science, and I know that that's a lot of what you guys focus on as well. At Tricom B2B, what are some of those things and some of the research that you find exciting about this role of emotion?
Well, I got to be careful. I don't want to sound like I'm the first person to profess that we need to have more emotion in our marketing. This is something that's been out in the market for quite a period of time now. I mean, you can go back to CEB, which is now part of Gartner, and Google, and the studies that they did that showed how important it is that buyers see some type of personal value in the brands that they work with. There's a lot of studies that speak to the higher margins that are commanded by brands that are making better connections with their customers. There's a great piece of research by Bain and Company about all of the subjective considerations that drive decisions and drive loyalty. And, I think probably everybody's heard by now Simon Sinek and the Golden Circle that gets to the why and why people engage with a brand. It's not what you do, it's why you do it. And all of that really points to one thing. It points to emotion. It points to not trying to outscore your competition, but really trying to find a different way to connect with them. And one of my favorite quotes, I use it all the time, and it's probably 10 or 11 years old now. Simon Hayward, who is a fellow at Gartner, said, most products are now good enough to serve the majority of users most of the time. And essentially what Mr. Hayward is saying there is, hey, it's parity out there in business to business. And if you're going to continue to market that way, you're going to be in trouble. You're going to end up being commoditized. You're going to end up competing on price. And if you're not tapping into that part of the decision maker psyche that really tips the scales and connects with your brand, you're going to be in trouble.
That's a great point. And some of what we're talking about here is literally just how the brain works. What are some of the things that we need to understand in order to maybe help us make this journey and bring more motion into our pitches, bring more motion into our marketing as B2B marketers?
Well, again, I'm probably the last person who should be discussing brain science, but there are some really well-published scientific studies, and they go back, as long as 50 or 60 years ago, where we really started to understand the role of the neocortex and the limbic system and your reptilian brain in decision making. And, we think, and I'm an engineer, so this is what I always thought, right? That you're using cognition and sensory perception and you're analyzing and processing and thinking to make decisions, pros and cons. Well, the research tells us now that it's your limbic system, the part that's really responsible for emotion and motivation and those unconscious things that make us feel something. That's the part of the brain that's actually activated during decision making. So, that part of the brain is looking for words and images that evoke emotion. And that's the strongest influencer on how we make decisions. And then, there's the reptilian brain, even more so. That's the fight or flight instincts that we have. That's the gut feeling that we say, hey, it's okay, it's safe to make a decision. And so now that we understand more that the emotion and the motivation and this gut feeling is really what's being activated as we make a decision, and the science really tells us that, I think the great brands figured that out. They're making those connections. They know how to create feelings about their brands that lead to decisions in their favor. And there's a lot of us that still need to do that.
And, I heard this one time at one point. I'm curious what your thoughts on it are. The idea that when something's very complex and it needs to be unpacked and all of these different research and all of these different contingencies are in play, sometimes it means that emotion is even more in play as the primary decision maker because no one could understand all the full implications of an incredibly technical product. And I know that that's something that you guys have a lot of experience with at Tricom B2B.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things that works hand in hand with this concept of emotion is the concept of simplicity. And, while we're on the subject of brain science, I think it's also important to understand a little bit about what the brain thinks of overload and information complexity. And so again, going back to, okay, how does the brain work? How are decisions made? And then also understanding how it consumes information. You put all of that together, and you also have to remember, hey, while we're thinking about how to re-message or maybe make that emotional connection, there's a few other things we need to think about. So if I have a very technical or complex product and I'm listing all of the facts, all of the features, all of the specifications, to some degree that's important. We have to be able to do the table stakes and the functional things that qualify you to be in the business. But at some point, if that's all we're doing and we're starting to overload with information, there's a lot of science out there will tell you also the brain hates that. It will shut down. It will even misinterpret information once you start to get to the point of complete overload. And worse than that, it will ignore information that you're trying to communicate. It's just too much. So these complex stories and complex statistics that we generally favor in business to business over a very simple and maybe somewhat emotional connection really gets in the way of our success. And, I think, we're not only missing out on the ability to connect emotionally sometimes, but sometimes we're doubling down and overloading the audience with just too much. And, you put those two things together. And again, it's a problem for marketing. I think it's a problem for kind of tipping the scales in your favor as a marketer.
If we could drill down and get a little practical, I know this is what you guys do day in and day out at Tricom B2B. If there's an example, or maybe even just kind of a 50,000 foot view of how you've seen brands that really had this problem of over communicating, overloading with technical information, and what was it that made them shift, and what sort of success did a brand potentially see from simplifying things through and through?
Yeah, I don't know that I'll be able to go back as far and say what did they used to do, but boy, there's a lot of great brands out there in business to business that get this concept and have been very successful. So a couple that come to mind. So John Deere is probably one of the great business to business brands that's always been recognized for their ability to make connections. They do a great job of bringing their end user customers into the forefront. You really understand how their customers feel and how they react to the John Deere brand. And they use those customers to make that connection with other customers. They're very good at getting the customer's voice and emotion into their marketing. And, another recent example that was pointed out to me by a member of our creative team was Corning. They've got a great product called Gorilla Glass, and you'll see that used in a lot of electronics, phones and so forth. And it has all of the strength and chemical and optical and electrical properties you can imagine. It's super scientific. It is very complex, and the physics and the chemistry that are involved are extraordinary. And how do they communicate this? They communicate it through soccer, through climbing, through racing, through parkour. The way they communicate has so much energy and emotion, and it's an incredibly scientific product, but you can't help but connect with it at a different level. So a couple of examples there, with John Deere and Corning, and there are many others. IBM does a beautiful job, whether we know it or not, of connecting with us at a different level with Watson. I mean, Watson stands for just about everything they do now, whether it's AI, whether it's a cloud solution. So those are the types of brands that have understood this for a long time. They really get it, and they've been highly successful, and their users and their buyers are extremely loyal to them as a result.
Some of that success comes from the use of emotion, and that it actually has empirical evidence that it works. You mentioned in some of your other research that I've read on your guys' site on Tricom B2B, that this actually is measured and can actually be seen on paper.
Yeah, of course. I go back to CEB, which part of Gartner. A while ago, I don't know how many years ago it was, but they came out with a study that was definitive in saying that your buyer is 50% more likely to buy from you when they see some personal value in your brand. And you can substitute emotional for personal there, right? You need to connect at a different level. And in that same exact study, a buyer who saw that personal value was 8 times more likely to pay a premium for your product. So think about that, 50% more likely to buy and 8 times more likely to pay a premium if they could find personal value in a brand. So it's just that alone, frankly, is enough information. Everybody should be doing this, right? So, and I mentioned earlier that, there's a lot of different sources that talk to higher profitability. Recent studies that showed 20% higher profit margins for brands that have stronger connections to their customers. Another study that I saw recently, and one that I really love, was one that was covered by the Harvard Business Review. And it was actually research done by Bain and Company. And Bain defines what they call these B2B elements of value. And they basically looked at 40 value words and kind of ranked them from the very bottom, the table stakes and the functional value type words like compliance and scalability and quality, all the way up through individual and more inspirational value elements like fun and reduced anxiety, social responsibility, vision, those types of words. And so in doing that, what they were able to do next was do a lot of research on how business to business decisions were being made and what elements of value were driving decisions and loyalty for large purchases in the business to business space. And what I love about this story is they give an example of one case study where I think it was cost reduction of those 40 words ranked like 27th in terms of an element of value. Essentially, it didn't matter in this certain category. But at the same time, the third or fourth highest ranked element of value was hope. And so think about the difference between cost reduction and hope. What word evokes emotion and personal value? So it's those types of things where you discover that words like hope and vision and cultural fit and safe and socially responsible resonate at a much, much higher level in terms of decision-making, success, and brand loyalty. And words like risk reduction and time savings and flexibility and product quality, yeah, you have to have those. You have to be able to check the box, but that's not where the messaging belongs, and that's not where decisions are being made.
Wow, that's fascinating stuff. I mean, that's incredible, the difference between those two words. And, I think that there's probably quite a few people in our audience who can look at their marketing efforts and say, this might be too technical. This might not be having enough emotion in it. Whenever you're meeting with a brand or meeting with a marketer and they're kind of at the starting point, what's some of the first steps that someone can take to really go down this journey of infusing more emotion into their marketing?
One of the first things I like to remind someone I'm working with or just somebody I'm trying to help out is that I think there's a belief that in business to business that buyers and users aren't all that emotionally attached to their brand. And it's actually quite the opposite. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of studies that will show you that consumers are much less emotionally attached to their brand than business to business buyers are to theirs. So I think making sure that people understand that, first and foremost, that it is possible to attract and retain relationships at a completely different level, a level that I think most people thought was reserved for consumers. It's actually there, and it's something to aspire to. Know that your buyers do buy on things like belief and hope, and they'll pay a premium for it. So, I think a way that people can start, and it's so basic. It's like it's in a marketing 101 is hey, let's talk to our customers about this, right, and understand why they really commit to you. What personal value are you satisfying for them? What feelings do they have about your brand that make them loyal to you? I think just starting there and understanding, why your best customers, and maybe not even some of your best customers, but just the people that use and are loyal to you every day, and understand how they're connected to you and what personal value or emotion you're fulfilling for them. And believe me, it's out there. We know it in all the businesses, all the client relationships we have. We know we're connected at a different level. It's not because we do great creative necessarily. It's not because we deliver on time necessarily, but there's something else we're doing for people in terms of how we make their personal and professional life function that's much more important to them. And I think once we make people understand that and help them dive into finding that information, that's a great place for people to start. From there, you can build a marketing platform. You can build a messaging platform that's a lot different than what they're going to see from your competitors.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great place to wrap up. If someone wants to discuss this more with you and learn how to infuse more emotion into their marketing and just learn about the role that it plays in B2B decision-making, what's the best way for someone to connect with you?
A couple of ways to connect. Obviously, you can go through our website. It's www.tricomb2b.com. That's B and the numeral 2b.com. I'm very active on LinkedIn. I love to connect with people there. So if you look up Chris Eifert on LinkedIn, you can connect with me there. And I'd love to start a conversation with you.
Fantastic. Chris, thanks again for being on the show. We really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thanks a lot, Sean.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big Three, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.